Welcome back from the break. Going to go ahead and get started leading into our second panel of the day. So if you could all take your seat, I will go ahead and get us moving again. Yeah. So our second panel of the day is going to be focused on building water resilience through connected land-water planning. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for the second panel, Brian Murphy of the River Network. Brian leads River Network's Healthy Resilient Rivers program in the Colorado River Basin, through which he offers technical assistance to coalitions, local governments, and organizations focused on river health and resilient communities. He's worked in water resources engineering and river science field for over 20 years, emphasizing community-based river values, nature-based solutions, and land conservation policies across Colorado. Before I hand over the mic here to Brian, just wanted to emphasize the use of our Menti platform during this panel. As you may have caught earlier, we have a special guest coming here at lunch. So we'll stay on time with the Menti platform, just making sure questions come in that way. Be sure to give questions that you like a thumbs up so our moderator, Brian, can filter those as they come in. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brian.
Thank you. Why don't you switch it while I talk? So good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Brian Murphy. I work for River Network. It's great to see so many friendly faces, and I really think that we have the best panel. So we're going to take, these kind of, at the end of the third panel, we'll have a little vote to see who had the best panel. But we're going to take it a step higher and move away from, to some degree, the science and policy, and really talk about the land and water connection, in particular here in the Yampa. We have a great suite of speakers between Andrea with Colorado Water Conservation Board, Andy with Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District, and then I'm super excited to have Kyle Monger come and talk about the things that he's been working on with the Cow Company here in the Yampa. To kick things off, I do have teenagers. I do have a dishwasher. I don't really have that many good dishwasher stories other than I can't get my kids to load the dishwasher. So Jackie's winning in that category, but anyway, let's skip ahead here. So to kick things off, I'm just going to spend a few minutes to set the stage. Really, many of you are likely familiar with the Yampa Integrated Water Management Plan. Nicole Seltzer was one of the key authors of the IWMP that came out of the Yampa White-Green Basin Roundtable. And it really helps describe, I think, and set the stage for this panel because it really is a key document in connecting land and water use in the Yampa. And that's really done through these, if I can go here, these 4 characteristics of a balanced river system. And I know there was lots and lots of discussions over the course of multiple years to come up with these 4 different characteristics. I'm not going to read them, but they do play in particular, human use of the river corridor and its water, the river corridor and the water in the river, and we're going to have 3 panelists that are going to talk about those. And then we'll have a quick break before we have the governor come in, or we'll have the governor come in and come back for Q&A. We'll see how that all transitions. I'm ready to have Kyle hand over the mic to the governor and see how that goes, but we'll go from there. Just a quick plug as I wrap up here for the Yampa. I really think it's an amazing document. I've studied it a lot and have helped implement a number of the projects here that are listed and strategies through the Yampa River Collaborative. And we're going to talk some about these, but you can't read all of them. But there are some of the specific projects and strategies that were identified here that are moving forward, thanks to many folks in the room here today. And as we transition to Andrea, she's going to talk about IWMPs and all kinds of other planning initiatives that the Colorado Water Conservation Board funds, and that will set up then Andy to talk about the Wildfire Ready Watersheds planning initiative that it's also funded by CWCB, and then we'll move into Kyle to talk really about some on-the-ground project work. So that's the run of the show, and we'll go from there. Depending on timing, we'll have 1 or 2 questions after each presenter, and then have that break for the governor, and then move back into a panel discussion. So we'll roll with it and go from there. So Andrea, if you want to come up, and we will start off with her presentation. So please welcome Andrea. She is Jackie set the bar really high for moderating, so I have to step up here. Andrea is a watershed scientist and a member of the Watershed and Flood Protection section of CWCB. She works a lot with Chris Sturm and Steve Reeves and other great folks there. Following graduate school, she worked in the private sector for a few years. She was actually one of my staff members at CDM for a while. So fabulous to have her in CWCB, where she joined in 2020 and spends most of her time helping administer the Watershed Restoration Program. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Brian. All right. Hold on a sec. All right. Oops. What did I do? Sorry, it's a touch screen. I don't know how to handle that. All right. My name is Andrea Harbin Monahan. I am a watershed scientist with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, where one of my primary responsibilities is helping to implement the Watershed Restoration Program, where we put together watershed projects throughout the state that either help to restore degraded watersheds and stream reaches or wetlands, or help to preserve the well-functioning stream reaches, wetlands, and watersheds that are already there. So one of the caveats that we have to implementation through the Watershed Health Program is that all of those projects need to be informed through a collaborative planning process. And so that can be difficult, but that helps us keep us from doing random acts of restoration, which Chris Sturm calls them. So if we're implementing a project down here, it's not going to have negative impacts upstream or downstream because we know that it was informed through a broader watershed lens. And so that's how we can just make sure that we're staying on the right track and doing what we need to be doing to do the good work for the watershed. And one of the things that we do to help implement, to help facilitate that planning is by helping to fund that planning. And so through the CWCB, we have many different planning efforts that we help to fund. We can fund up to 75% of most of those planning efforts. But they all have different outcomes, and it can be very overwhelming for a lot of entities to even attempt to undertake them. And a lot of times there's multiple plans within a watershed, and so figuring out how to integrate those plans, determining what data needs are, where the data gaps exist, it can all be very overwhelming and daunting. And so I put together this flow chart in an attempt to simplify that process, distill the information, and hopefully just make it more digestible for those folks who are feeling like their watershed needs a plan to actually undertake that. So up above, we have a variety of different planning types in blue that we fund through the CWCB. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are the types of plans that we see most often and that we implement from most often. And then below that in the gray, these are the outcomes that we would ideally see from each of these types of plans. And then below that in the red are the types of project recommendations that would ideally result from these planning efforts. So as Brian mentioned, we helped fund the Yampa River Integrated Water Management Plan, also known as an IWMP, also used interchangeably with Stream Management Plan or SMP. And these are plans that should result in a flow target for some identified risk. So in the Yampa, I don't remember off the top of my head, but one of the biggest assets here is the recreation. And so having adequate flows for recreation could be important. Or for a certain aquatic species, maybe there's a fishery that may not have adequate flows. And so an SMP may want to figure out a flow target to maintain that fishery. And so the project recommendations that we would like to see out of those plans are those that would help to get to that flow target. So maybe an in-stream flow water right or water leasing or something along those lines. We also fund EPA 9 elements plans, which are also known as watershed-based plans, and these are water quality focused, looking at a specific contaminant of concern and determining what the total maximum daily load is for that contaminant of concern. And a total maximum daily load is the maximum amount that a water body or stream reach can handle of that contaminant without crossing that threshold into impairment. And so the outcomes from these plans are going to be strategies and best management practices that would help meet that total maximum daily load. And then similarly, source water protection plans are also water quality focused, and these are focused on drinking water protection, so finding strategies and best management practices to protect sources of drinking water. And then riverscape planning is, these are plans that have pretty much anything to do with the river corridor, whether it be the geomorphology, riparian vegetation, just general riparian health. And we funded a lot of these plans in the wake of the 2013 floods along the Front Range. And they were interesting because those plans tended to be two-pronged in that they were very focused on the short-term restoration of that disaster and looking at how we can restore the geomorphology where there was maybe excessive erosion or undercutting. But then they also focused on long-term strategies to increase the resilience of those river corridors, which I think is the bread and butter of these types of plans, because we want to make sure that we are looking at those fluvial areas and making sure that those river corridors are resilient enough to absorb the next natural disaster that comes through. And so a lot of those plans were quite forward-thinking in that way. And then the outcomes of those plans are going to be pretty much anything that helps restore the riverscape function, helps the river move to where it's going to move, because rivers are dynamic and we know that. And that's not always possible to let the river move, but we do what we can. So other project recommendations might be bank hardening or even diversion reconstruction if that's an issue in that particular location. And then finally, we have wildfire ready action plans, and these are called WRAPs. These are part of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program that Kelly mentioned earlier. And these are looking specifically at post-wildfire susceptibility. And so these plans try to identify hazards within a watershed that are going to happen after a fire. So we know that after a fire, the risk of flooding is elevated, as is the risk of debris flows and sedimentation. And so determining where those hazards are likely to occur, and then determining where in that watershed we have critical values, such as life and property, road and bridge, drinking infrastructure, aquatic habitat, things of that nature. And then where those hazards intersect those critical values, that's where we have values at risk, and that's where we can identify mitigation projects to help protect those values at risk in the event of a fire. So implementation projects here are going to be projects that we can implement now, today, to protect ourselves from the fire that's imminent tomorrow. And so a lot of those projects are going to look like wet meadow restoration that can help attenuate flow and sediment and debris upstream of values at risk. But it could also include things like culvert replacement for bigger culverts to help pass through sediment and debris, or even redundant drinking water supplies if that's an issue in the watershed. And then I also included community wildfire protection plans here, even though these are not watershed plans because they're not typically at the watershed scale, and the CWCB cannot fund these plans, but they can be very complementary to a wildfire ready action plan. And these plans are going to identify mitigation efforts to mitigate wildfire risk, and the projects coming out of these plans are going to be more upland fuelscape type projects that, when combined with the projects coming out of WRAPs, could create just more watershed-wide resiliency to wildfire. So that's why they're included here, and I think they're important. And they could provide some cost efficiencies if a community wanted to undergo a WRAP and a CWPP at the same time. So that's that. Okay. So probably 7 or 8 or 10-ish years ago, the CWCB established the Stream Management Planning Program. And we funded a lot of SMPs, and that's awesome. We love to see it. We like flows. We like to see water in our rivers, and that was great. But what we found was that communities that wanted to undergo a plan in their watershed felt like if they wanted to get CWCB funding, that that plan had to be an SMP. And that's just not the case. It's never been the case. And an SMP may not even be the appropriate plan for your watershed, depending on what issues you're experiencing. And so we're trying to take a step back and encourage communities to undergo a basic watershed assessment first. Nothing fancy, just a simple collecting data on hydrology, geomorphology, biology, and chemistry at a bare minimum, and then also probably including things like land ownership and land use. But very objective data that you can collect and bring back to your stakeholders to determine where further issues might exist within the watershed. And, you know, a watershed assessment might be enough for the stakeholders to find some kind of consensus on some actionable project recommendations that they could undergo in the watershed, and that's great. Then you can just move on to implementation and get CWCB funding and do some great work. Or they might identify some issues with flows, in which case maybe they do want to go towards the SMP route, or maybe there's a water quality issue and they want to do an EPA 9 elements plan or a source water protection plan, or maybe there's excessive erosion or floodplain disconnection somewhere and they want to do some riverscape planning, and all of that is well and good. And then we can help provide funding to further refine those planning efforts. And it may not be the case that those plans need to be at the same geographic scope as the whole watershed assessment. It's probably the case that those issues are at a reach scale or at the sub-basin scale. And so you can further refine that planning within that watershed and find some project recommendations within that sub-basin or that sub-reach. And then for the wildfire ready action plans, the watershed assessment looks just a little bit different, because what we have found is that communities that want a RAP are very wildfire focused, and they want a RAP regardless of any other issues within the watershed, which is fine because we all know that wildfire is imminent and that's terrifying, and we want to get to project recommendations quickly and implementation quickly. And so for the RAP, the watershed assessment is probably going to be a little more granular. You're still going to look at hydrology and geomorphology and biology and chemistry, but you're going to look at it through a wildfire lens, and more specifically through a post-wildfire lens, and in terms of hazards. So you're going to look at all the hazards that can happen within a watershed in terms of flooding, sedimentation, debris flow, water quality, all of that, and then you're going to collect data on your critical values and find out where that overlap exists and where you can implement projects. And then again, here I added the Community Wildfire Protection Program just to underscore the fact that there's a lot of overlap in data collection with a RAP, and specifically in terms of the values at risk within a watershed. And so, like I said before, there's a lot of cost efficiencies that could be had if you're undergoing a CWPP and a RAP at the same time. And then also in terms of that project implementation, there's a lot of efficiencies as well. If you find some upland fuelscape treatments coming out of a CWPP that complement the riverscape treatments coming out of a RAP, you can do those together to leverage funding sources and find some efficiencies. And so with all of these plans, what the CWCB wants to see is actionable project recommendations coming out of these plans. We don't want planning just for the sake of more planning. We want to see implementation. And so that's the ultimate goal. And we can talk further about that later if there's questions about funding. But that's my spiel, so thank you.
So we have time for just a question. Just a reminder, use Menti. I'll give you a second if you want to put one in. Andrea, can you just mention quickly the funding that's available for planning that comes from CWCB for these different initiatives?
Certainly. I'm going to start with wildfire ready action plans because that funding source is quickly expiring. We do have a large pot of money specifically for wildfire-ready watersheds, and we can fund up to 75% of a RAP through that funding source. But we're only taking applications through the end of September, and then that funding source is going to expire at the end of the year. And so get your applications in. We can also fund implementation projects through that program that have a fire nexus if they've been identified through another plan, even if it's not a RAP, but you just have to demonstrate that wildfire post-impact nexus, and that can be funded through that funding source as well. Again, it expires at the end of the year, so get your applications in. We can also fund any of these planning with 75% of the plan with 25% match through our water plan grant programs. And Ashley Garrison is in the back of the room. She's the project manager for the Yampa Basin for water plan grants. And those application deadlines are July 1 and December 1 of every year. So, and then the implementation projects coming out of these plans, we can typically fund up to 50% of those also through the water plan grant program.
And one quick follow-up, are you seeing more demand for grant funding than there's supply from the water the bucket available?
Yes, the last couple of rounds of water plan grants have been quite competitive, which is what it is. But we solicited a lot of grants a couple of years ago because we had a lot of funding, and then we ended up getting a lot of applications, and we didn't have enough funding. So it's great to see great projects coming in, and we love to fund great projects, but they are getting competitive. So making sure that they are informed through a collaborative planning process makes them more competitive. Making sure that their multi-benefit makes them more competitive. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
We'll have Andrea come back up after for the panel Q&A. Next up is Andy Rossi with the Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District. I once made the mistake of saying Water Conservation District, and Andy didn't take that very well. So he set me straight on the difference. Prior to taking on the leadership role in 2019 as the general manager, Andy worked as a water resources consulting engineer and the Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District engineer. Andy first moved to Steamboat Springs in 2001 and enjoyed the water resources of the Yampa Valley both professionally, recreationally, and with his family, I know, ever since. So please welcome Andy. Great, thank you. We'll wrap up your presentation for now and have Kyle come up, and we'll have time for further questions after Kyle. So many of you may know the Monger family, and Kyle is carrying on the tradition of working in the Yampa Valley. He's a fifth-generation cattle rancher born and raised here in Steamboat. He has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from University of Northern Colorado, and he came back home after college to help run the cow-calf ranching operation at their ranch headquarters just outside of Hayden, Colorado. And with that, we're going to let Kyle, I think, tell some stories, which will be really exciting about some of the, we're going down a level here to some of the problems from flooding that happened. This past, I guess, every year. But yeah, I think your pictures, anyway, I'll turn it over to Kyle and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you. Mine's going to have a couple less graphs, probably a little more ranchy, I would imagine, than the last one. A little less scientific. To go to the next slide. Okay, cool. So like he said, my name is Kyle Monger. My great-grandparents were actually homesteaders here in the late 1800s at the base of Sleeping Giant Mountain. Our current ranching operation is based on the Yampa River. Our ranch is right outside of Hayden. We've had that place since 1994. We're a commercial cow-calf operation. If anyone knows where the Carpenter Ranch is, we are the first ranch west of the Carpenter Ranch. We're very fortunate to live along the mighty Yampa River. I call it the mighty Yampa River. Two incredible irrigation ditches that get their water for our operation from the Yampa. For example, the ditch I'll talk about more is the Walker Ditch. It was dug in the late 1890s. It's meant to provide irrigation water to many of the ranches along the Morgan Bottom, all the way to the town of Hayden. The Walker Ditch is approximately 3 miles long. It is the number 2 priority water right on the Yampa River. 43% of the water supplied by the ditch is applied to lands protected by conservation easements. Our ranch is also protected by a conservation easement as well. The ditch provides water to various municipal and industrial uses, recreational areas, parks, cemetery, nursing home, a school. It makes it all the way from the river at our place all the way into Hayden. So a lot of people use the water from the ditch. It's an incredible thing. We actually completely rebuilt the head gate and the point of diversion in 2021, so pretty recently. Living with the river and its changing course keeps us on our toes, for sure. We'll go ahead and show you just how much the river has changed in the last 100 years. So if you can see from this slide here, the blue is where it was in the 1890s when the ditch was started. In 1940, it decided to change course again, took another meander, took another turn, and completely cut off the original head gate. So from 1940 to 1983, we were where the red is. So they had to figure out how to get the water into the irrigation ditch from there. Then in 1983, it changed course again, another meander. And so you can see the river kind of does what it wants, basically, is my presentation here. And we know that firsthand. Every year it's completely different, and every year we see it flood a different way, different fields flood. It's a beast. I'll just say that. It is a beast, for sure. In the spring, the river is an incredible force. You have to be aware that time of year where you are, where your animals are, firsthand. You need to move things to higher ground. You kind of got to be on your toes. Don't build your fence along the riverbank, for sure. We learned that. Let's see. I think I have a little slide here. I'll show you this little calf rescue here. Maybe. Yeah. Okay, well, you get the point here. That is actually an old river meander that fills up every spring because it floods so bad. That cow decided to, in the middle of the night, swim across into the island, have her calf, and then the next morning we discovered it. So newborn calves don't exactly swim very well, so had to do a little canoe cowboying and go get the calf. And actually, it's kind of a cool video, but she followed me and swam with her calf right across the meander, so it was kind of cool. But yeah, that kind of stuff happens often, for sure. In a matter of hours, the ditch and the ranch can be underwater, for sure. And I'll go ahead and show you guys a couple of these flooding pictures that we've had throughout the years. Like I said, I couldn't tell you exactly what year. I mean, every other year it's a crazy flood, it seems like. So here's one here. I don't know if, I guess my mouse isn't really showing up, but that's a bunch of our hayfields there, basically. The river kind of falls where those trees are back there, is where it's supposed to normally fall. And as you can see, it flooded pretty good. Here's some more here. So this is something we deal with every year. Not always to this extent, but it's pretty serious. Doing a good job irrigating, though, for sure. There's more. Those are our hayfields. More hayfields. More canoeing. More cowboy canoeing. You can see the calf there in front of me. He's cool. I would say it's crucial for us as landowners to get our uses out of the ditch as quickly as it's here. Something we do. I mean, the flooding is crazy, but as quick as the flooding and the water is here, by late August, a lot of times it's gone. So it's important to utilize the water while we have it and be very efficient with it. Communication with other ditch users is key. Obviously, it's only 3 miles long, but there's a lot of us that use the water on the ditch. So I'm kind of the ditch rider, even though we don't really have a ditch rider, but I'm in charge of the adjusting and making sure we're getting efficient uses out of our water and everybody gets the water that they need, and then it makes it into town so everybody can get their water. Usually by late September, most of the ranches along the ditch are ready to dry out and cut their hay anyway, which works out okay because there's not a whole lot of water left. So I would say the Walker Ditch and the Williams Ditch, which is the other main irrigation ditch that we get our water from the river, are incredibly unique in that the water used for the irrigation will eventually end up back into the water table or into the river itself. Even the water that makes it to Hayden, the water that isn't used will end up back into the river just because of the location of the river and how the water goes into the irrigation ditches. Naturally, it's going to flow back into the fields, end up back into the river, eventually one way or another. So, in closing, I would say the Yampa River is the lifeblood of the agricultural lands that encompass it. I have an immense amount of love and respect for the Yampa River. It's everything to us. The circle of life, with everything we do on the ranch, begins and ends with water in the river. So, that's it.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I'm going to have Andrea and Andy join me up here with Kyle, and as they make their way up here, Kyle, really interesting seeing the contrast between you trying to move water in a ditch and then the flooding that's happening, and you're understanding the word you just used of respecting the river and it being a beast. Can you talk a little bit about how you all work with the river or try and work with the river to move water through the ditch, but also understanding that it's dynamic and it's going to be a challenge to really understand what's going to happen every year.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to really know what it's going to do. We're kind of at its mercy. We do flood irrigation is how when we're trying to irrigate, when we want the water and we're getting the water onto our hay fields, but then, like you said, the flooding, it's a weird deal because the flooding is so gnarly and so it's everywhere and it's uncontrollable, and then a lot of times, 3 weeks, a month later, we don't have any water, and we're really struggling to get the water onto the field. So it's a crazy dynamic that we have to deal with.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It leads me to a question, maybe for both Andrea and Andy. Of Andrea, you talked a little bit about the various programs that CWCB has. Can you elaborate a little bit on the fluvial hazard zone mapping that the Conservation Board funds and how that plays into kind of better understanding of some of the dynamics of the river? And Andy, I'll ask you a little bit more about kind of moving water down in a second.
Yeah, so following the floods of 2013 along the Front Range, we established the Fluvial Hazard Zone Mapping Program because we saw that a lot of the flood insurance claims were actually coming from outside of the regulatory floodplain, and so we saw that we needed to integrate other erosional hazards into the flooding area and understand that the river is dynamic and it moves and it goes where it wants to go, and there's only so much you can do about it. And so we do fund fluvial hazard zone mapping, where you can figure out where your active avulsion zones are and your fluvial hazard buffers, and you can make land use decisions based on where those boundaries are, and that would be considered a planning grant subject to 25% match.
And Andy, kind of following on that, you having lived in Steamboat for so long, and on the infrastructure side, how do you approach some of those delicate conversations around protecting property and human infrastructure that really has been built directly on a floodplain, either in a FEMA-regulated floodplain or a fluvial hazard zone, or, and you deal with reservoirs that are in, fire zones. So talk a little bit about that kind of delicate nature of those conversations.
Yeah, they are delicate, and you have to be respectful. I think to tie it back to what you were just saying, the map I put up there from our hydraulic analysis, that's in an area where there is no existing FEMA floodplain mapping. So how we go about presenting that information, not just to the landowner right there, but the emergency services community and then the town of Yampa, could have some pretty dramatic effects on how they choose to move forward with their land use planning. Or you could even get in the very unfortunate position of getting into almost like a takings of property value situation where you've presented an analysis that may be misinterpreted. So it's really important to have your communication skills at a very high level, and if you need help, get somebody in there to help you communicate some of the complex concepts that you're analyzing to the community. So on that map, for example, again, we are analyzing a very specific engineering design storm over an area with a very specific type of fire. And so it can get misinterpreted very quickly. And so it's really important that you work not only with the consultant and the analyst who did that, but the community whose job it is to interface with the public to get the message out in the right way and make sure it's not misinterpreted.
Thank you. Kind of following on that communication approach, and Kyle, this is for you. Working with funding agencies and other groups, can you talk a little bit about you or how your family, kind of some of the greatest concerns with ranching in riverscapes or along the Yampa River, and how you've relied on, either local agencies or other types of community outreach when you guys have struggled with ranching, in the bottoms?
Yeah, I would say the water is always the key issue. The funding is there if you do things right and if you look for it. And I would say too, it's helped a lot being neighbors with the Nature Conservancy. They've helped out a lot. There's government money out there to fix these things and to get the water that you need. It's just going out and getting it, and that's been something that my dad has been really good about, and I think it's something you need to stay on top of for sure. But making sure you're doing things right and correct, yeah.
Yeah, maybe a follow-on, and this is related to an audience question as well, is have you seen an evolution in maybe your dad's approach or your family's thinking about how you work with the river and what that means in terms of locations of the head gates and moving things around to work more with the river rather than trying to control it?
Yeah, I don't think control is ever something you can do with the river. It's more of just working with the river and working with what it gives you. We try and hire the right people to do the right figuring of, well, this should work or this shouldn't work, or what you need to do to get the water out of the river. But yeah, we're kind of winging it in a way, like we always have, but as intelligently as we can wing it too. So
sure,
yeah.
Sure. Well, and following on that and trying to use planning to wing it a little less. Andrea, can you talk a little bit more about how the riverscape work or restoration work and planning for that ties in with RAPs or community wildfire protection plans, and kind of how those dovetail a little bit more, maybe in an integrated planning type of scenario?
So typically a RAP is going to identify that riverscape work that's going to be necessary to mitigate post-wildfire impacts. But then you'll have other planning efforts like the CWPPs, or I feel like you mentioned something else with the co-swap and the hazards fuel reduction. All of that could potentially count as match for that riverscape work. And so I was at a stakeholder meeting a few weeks ago for the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, and they had a great little schematic where they honed in on a Huck 14 that they wanted to do upscale, upland, fuelscape work, and then they also had identified some riverscape work in that same Huck 14, and that is their project area, that entire Huck. And so they could come in to the CWCB for an implementation grant for that riverscape work, and those upland fuelscape tasks could be tasks within that scope of work that we're not funding directly, but those could count as your 50% cash match for that riverscape work. And so that's how we can leverage planning efforts against each other and funding sources against each other in an efficient way.
Thank you. And kind of a follow-on maybe that Andy has been successful at kind of leveraging different funds. I'm curious, Andy, kind of, you touched on it a little bit, but some of the outcomes from the RAP are various projects, and you talked about, the cost and the scale of what you can do with those. Are there things that you're already starting to talk about within the Conservancy District and with your consultant, about larger funding pots or other projects that you might be able to make stretch a little bit further?
Yeah, and maybe back up a little bit to the previous question. In this whole sort of ecosystem of doing these analyses and then trying to translate onto the ground, the analysis part ends up being the least expensive. It maybe seems like the most complex. So if you're thinking about doing one of these, I would recommend don't fear a wide project scope. Just realize once that analysis is done, the ability to be able to implement things on the ground across that whole area is going to be much harder. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And so my approach has been, what can we get done in a reasonable amount of time? Because people and agencies tend to lose interest in political personnel change. You never know when the funding's going to dry up. So what can we do in a reasonable amount of time? To me, that means 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 years out. Also, what can you do to identify that might have a very specific, no matter how simple, but impactful effect on the community? So where we're working, there's like one road in, one road out up there. So something as simple as maybe trying to partner with the U.S. Forest Service and Routt County on analyzing all of their culverts for debris flow susceptibility and then helping them get access either to the funds at the state or at the federal level to go in and analyze and, upgrade or fix or relocate those. Something that very specific but seeming a little bit mundane, I think can go a long way in getting the community sort of involved. And then you'll be surprised how much funding is out there for the boring stuff. It's actually available and it's out there, fixing culverts. Doesn't sound like much, but it could have a huge impact on a very local community there.
Yeah, I'm curious, kind of, you touched a little bit on it, but one of the questions from the audience is about education. And have you seen this either in the Wildfire Ready Action Plan, the analysis, and maybe outside of the analysis, but some of the potential outcomes of working with the Forest Service on educating campers to enforce campfire rules and regulations, or kind of where does that play into any of this?
I will put a big poster of that map I showed in the middle of my presentation everywhere I can, just to make sure we're all aware of it. It's a threat, and there's a lot of really horrific outcomes that can come out of wildfire. We all know that. I'm learning a lot. This is a new technical and education space for me, and trying to learn how the analysis is done, from how the data is gathered, and how you go about just implementing these projects has been a huge learning process for me. But also, once I gain that knowledge, it is important for me, and I feel a responsibility to get that out to the folks I'm going to try to work with, like you said. And maybe we need to just go out and help put up more posters, or have a public service announcement on local radio, and just lean into that space a little bit more. And I know Josh Hankes from the Routt County Wildfire Mitigation Council is here. That's someone I would like to help a lot, because that's the person and their organization is going to help me in those areas that we're not really active in yet. And maybe the state has similar programs.
Yeah, I would just say that in terms of a wrap, that education and outreach component would be a project recommendation that comes out of that. And similarly, with the Forest Service, you could recommend a memorandum of understanding, or start getting the NEPA process underway as a project recommendation that's actually coming out of that wrap that we can help fund. And you can just start doing it now.
Yeah. Kyle, I'm curious a little bit, kind of shifting back to some of the damages and the challenges with the Yampa. How does your ranch fund or identify potential ways of dealing with the damages that come with, either annual or every other year type of damages? And have you tapped into other funding pots, or is it mainly coming out of your guys' pocket to deal with those damages?
Yeah, most of it's coming out of our pocket, probably. Yeah, like I said, we've kind of gotten used to what will probably happen with the river, and there's a lot of old meanders that only hold water in the spring when the water's high, and other than that, they're abandoned. Like I said, we don't build the fence right on the riverbank anymore. We know better than that. We've done work to restore the riverbanks as well, and that's helped some. Yeah, it mostly comes out of our pocket.
Yeah, I'm curious, just kind of following on what Andrea was just talking about too, the funding from an implementation standpoint. Does the CWCB provide funding to help with, certainly restoration on private lands, but can you talk a little bit about some funding options for properties that are in river bottoms that experience seasonal damages?
Yeah, if it's been identified in a plan, absolutely, we could help with that funding. There's precedent in the Gunnison for sure. We've helped with a lot of that funding through Trout Unlimited as the fiscal agent. But we can help with bank armoring, we can help with fluvial hazard zone mapping, we could help with diversion reconstruction. But like I said, having it identified in a plan is one of the caveats, and then also making sure it's a multi-benefit project. So a lot of those diversion reconstructions, if they incorporate fish passage, boom, that's a multi-benefit project, so we can help fund that.
All right, so we're nearing the end of the session. One of the things I just wanted to do is just give each of the panelists an opportunity either to talk, this is the softball question, to talk a little bit about, where they see the biggest opportunity in this crossroads of land and water resiliency, or the biggest challenge. And you could certainly talk about both, but maybe Kyle, I'll start with you. What do you see, for you and your family's operation as the biggest opportunities or challenges within the Yampa and what you've been able to experience and share today?
Yeah, I would say we're able to keep going and keep doing what we've always done, but it's just a matter of doing it smarter. It's planning things out a little better. It's being ready when the time is there to, all right, we have a month to irrigate. We need to do a good job. We need to make sure that everything's measured out and that we're efficient. We're not wasting water. All the water that we're getting the water we need, and we're sending it down to the neighbor, and the neighbor's using that water. And so I think as we go into the future, it's more important to use the water right and intelligently, and I think we can continue doing what we're doing, and when we're doing a lot of good for the wilderness as well, and all the animals that live there along with our cows. So I think we're benefiting a lot of stuff. It's just a matter of keep doing it smart.
Yeah, that's great. Andy, I'm curious, going up one level, kind of your role as the general manager, what do you see as some of the opportunities and or maybe associated challenges in the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I will say, as I reflect on it just here in a few minutes, I would say the biggest challenge and the greatest opportunity are the same thing. And I'll use a couple examples, the wildfire work that we're trying to instigate now, but also, there's another big question in Western water is sort of return flows and the role that flood irrigation has in its effect on either maintaining or changing the riparian habitat and the corridors there. And it's this fear of unintended consequences either from a policy or from, implementing a project on the ground. Water managers, we've got a terrible record in the United States, especially in the West, and, going full bore into something and really kind of over-engineering and messing something up. So with that knowledge, knowing that there can be some unintended consequences to something you might want to do, it's important for us, and here's the opportunity, is to partner with folks like Kyle and to listen, understand what they've learned from observing their own piece of ground that they work on. They're out there a lot more than we are, and other people who are out on the ground. I mentioned you shouldn't work on a watershed you haven't walked across. Well, go talk to the people who are out there every day looking at things, either looking at the effects of wildfire or been managing a piece of ground through different hydrologies, and listen to them and then take that knowledge and put it into these difficult problems we're trying to fix.
One question, I would just, quick follow-on to that. Andy, can you talk just quickly about some of the science-based initiatives that the Conservancy District follows? I wanted to tee this up a little bit because I know it's a big thing for you, and not to open a can of worms, but,
Yeah, no, that's all right, and maybe the governor can wait an hour because that's what it would take for me to get through all of this. But yes, good question, and a lot of folks in this room are helping us out with a lot of those scientific endeavors, everything from trying to establish a soil moisture and meteorological data station network here in the Yampa and then across the rest of the state. There was a great discussion from that working group yesterday, and I mean, they're working through the nitty-gritty of it, so I have a lot of optimism for that. other folks in the room here are helping out with things. People who we've mentioned before, Jeff Deans from ASO, and I don't know if there's anyone else from the USGS here. We're really putting a lot of effort into recognizing that the climate has changed, and so the way we look at snow data and how we use that in both reservoir and stream flow forecasting needs to change as well. So there's two efforts going there. Jeff Dean's work group, they don't just go up and collect the snow data. They can actually give you some new forecasting products that can tell you a little bit more about the specifics of how the snow is coming off, and we're also taking some of that data and we're going to try to integrate it into a new expansion of two forecasting models. One is called the snow model, which the USGS has developed as part of its NGWA system across the West, but we're going to apply that here in the Yampa Valley and see how it does on also forecasting. And then we have a new initiative that we just got some funding from the Bureau of Reclamation, significant amount of funding to work with one of the scientists at CW3E to expand the Wharf Hydro model, which is another forecasting model, to the entire Yampa Basin. And then what we're going to do is we're going to tie that to what is the state of Colorado's water supply planning model called State Mod. Any of you guys who are familiar with that, and try to integrate all of these different new technologies into some of the existing useful tools that we have and see what that produces. So that's a little bit of it. We've got a lot of other water quality and other projects going on, which I could talk a lot about, but I think I'll cut it off there.
That sounds great. I just wanted to tie it to the first panel. Again, we're the second panel. Make sure you vote for us at the end of the rendezvous. But I do want to just give Andrea a sense, maybe even you could talk statewide, some of the opportunities or bigger challenges when it comes to that land and water, nexus, or some of the resiliency options.
Yeah, I feel like the biggest challenge that we have right now is simply in capacity. Like, we have the money there to do the planning, there's enthusiasm to do the planning, there's enthusiasm to do implementation, but we just don't really have the boots on the ground to get it done. And so that's been a challenge. I feel like there's also a big challenge in terms of building trust among stakeholders and different coalitions, and that's why we rely on people like Andy, who have built the trust of his community, and people actually rely on him to get projects done. And for the state of the science, they believe you when you tell them that that's the way things are. And so I think those are the biggest challenges, but the biggest opportunities are just the enthusiasm that's out there to get it done, and I think that's great, and there's a lot of leverage there.
Well, that concludes the panel. We're done just a couple minutes early, so I think unless there's any questions from the audience, we can call it a wrap for the second panel and get ready for lunch. The governor should be here. I don't know, Jenny, if you have a real-time update. Okay. So we're at his schedule, but we'll go on a break, and then do you want to talk anything about logistics for lunch?
Yeah, I have a quick few logistics updates here. Give a round of applause for the... Okay, so just checking in on our timeline for the rest of the day and the conference moving forward here. As you all are aware, we have a special signing that will be happening in about 5 minutes. So we'll open up both doors here on either side of the auditorium and move on to the back patio for the signing. After the signing, we do have lunch provided for all registered guests, so you can go over to the Sodexo Dining Hall, which is going to be on this corner of the building here, and pick up your lunch. So happy to have you all engage in conversations during lunch here. Following lunch, we have our afternoon field excursion. I'll bring up a slide here. So this excursion is going to be focusing on monitoring in the Yampa Basin. We'll be visiting a soil moisture monitoring station and have talks featuring Marty Ralph, Michelle Stewart, and Ryan Adams. We'd also like to invite you all to the Boathouse tonight. So this is a venue downtown in Steamboat, 609 Yampa Street, where we'll have our community showcase. So this is going to feature posters from many more presenters than you saw today. We'll also have food and drinks provided at that event and an opportunity to get branded. So definitely don't miss that, and we'd like to see you all there tonight. Okay, real-time update, 12:30 to 12:40 for the signing. So let's go ahead. We can all pick up lunch in the Sodexo dining area at 12:30-ish. Let's be out on the back deck with lunches, if that works for everyone. Yeah. And with that, I'll go ahead and release you all. Thank you.